The late afternoon sun scorched the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the dust-choked trail. John McAllister stood outside his small wooden cabin, wiping sweat from his brow when he first heard the sound. Hoofbeats. Fast. Aggressive. Getting closer. Seconds later, 5 riders stormed into view. Bandits, rifles drawn, eyes burning with greed and violence. "Where's the gold, old man?" one shouted, dismounting with a sneer. John froze, heart pounding. Gold? What gold? Then it hit him. Just hours earlier, a stranger had stumbled onto his property. Dirty, bleeding, desperate. Without a word of explanation, the man had pressed a small, heavy object into John's hand. A rough, gleaming gold nugget the size of a walnut. "I owe you one," the stranger had whispered before disappearing into the hills. Now, John understood the price of that kindness. Inside the cabin, his hunting rifle rested against the wall, but getting to it meant crossing open ground under 5 loaded rifles. Dust swirled. Tension thickened. The bandits grew more impatient. John's mind raced. Fight? Run? Talk his way out? Either way, this day had taken a turn he never saw coming. As one bandit cocked his rifle and took a step forward, John knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, his quiet life in the desert was over. And it had all started with one stranger and one gold nugget. John McAllister wasn't a man many folks noticed, nor one they remembered. At 42, he lived alone on the edge of the Arizona territory, somewhere between nowhere and forgotten. His cabin sat by a dry creek bed, the nearest neighbor 10 dusty miles away. Years of sun, wind, and solitude had carved deep lines into his face, and the desert had taught him one thing above all: trust no one and expect even less. A former Union soldier turned prospector, John had spent the last decade scratching at the earth for copper, silver, or anything else that might glint in the sun. Most days, he came back with nothing but dirt under his nails and sore shoulders from swinging a pickaxe. Still, he never complained, not out loud anyway. Life wasn't fair, but it was simple. And for a man like John, simple was enough. His days followed a steady rhythm. Sunrise coffee boiled over a wood stove, hours of work at the rocky hills nearby, evenings spent cleaning his tools or patching up the cabin's weather-beaten walls. Nights? Those were for whiskey and staring at the stars, thinking about a life that might have been. Maybe a family back east if things had turned out different. But there were reasons John lived alone. Memories of war, old betrayals, lost friends buried in shallow graves. People were unpredictable, and out here, that kind of unpredictability could get a man killed. Still, John wasn't bitter, just cautious. His reputation in the nearby town of Dustwater was quiet but respectable. Folks knew him as the man who kept to himself, paid his debts, and didn't stir up trouble. He was the guy you nodded to at the general store, but didn't invite over for supper. And that was fine by him. He wasn't fast with a gun like some of the younger ranch hands, but he knew how to shoot when it counted. Years of hunting mule deer and defending himself from the occasional desperate outlaw had kept his instincts sharp. But deep down, John always had this uneasy feeling, like trouble had been circling him for years, just waiting for the right moment. That moment came the day the stranger arrived. It was late afternoon when John spotted him, a lone figure stumbling down the trail, half collapsing just yards from John's porch. Blood streaked down the man's temple, and his hand shook as he reached into his coat pocket. Without saying much, the stranger shoved a gold nugget, heavy and unmistakably real, into John's palm. "I owe you one," he muttered, before staggering back to his feet and disappearing toward the ridgeline. John had stood there for a full minute, staring at the gold, turning it over in his calloused hands, wondering what kind of trouble this stranger had dragged to his doorstep. Unfortunately, it didn't take long to find out, because now 5 armed men wanted answers. And John McAllister was standing between them and what they thought was theirs. Dustwater was the kind of place that didn't show up on most maps. A scatter of weathered buildings clung to the edge of the desert like survivors of a war no one remembered. One saloon, one general store, a blacksmith, and a sheriff's office that was more porch than jail. The air smelled of dust, horses, and whiskey. When the wind kicked up, it carried with it the sharp sting of sand that got into your eyes, your clothes, even your teeth. John McAllister's cabin sat 8 miles south of town, beyond Dead Man's Ridge and near a dry riverbed called Coyote Creek. Locals called that stretch of land cursed. Too many stories of travelers disappearing, bandits hiding out, coyotes that sounded too close to human cries at night. The landscape around his home was both beautiful and unforgiving. Towering red rock cliffs loomed in the distance. Mesquite trees twisted in strange shapes, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers reaching for the sky. By day, the sun beat down like a hammer, turning the dirt to cracked leather. By night, the temperature dropped fast, and the desert sang with the howls of unseen predators. John's cabin was small but sturdy, timber walls reinforced with stone at the base, a single front porch where he'd sit most evenings with his rifle across his knees. The windows were covered with faded curtains, and the inside smelled of wood smoke, gun oil, and the faint bitterness of black coffee. A battered iron stove stood in the corner, and above it hung a map of the surrounding territory, edges curling from years of sun exposure. His water came from a shallow well behind the house when it didn't dry up. Firewood was stacked neatly along the sidewall. A few rusted traps lay near the shed, forgotten since his last attempt at catching rabbits. But the most important thing John kept close was his rifle. A Winchester lever-action .44-40. Reliable, worn smooth from years of handling. More than once, it had saved his life from rattlesnakes, mountain lions, or worse, men with bad intentions. That's why, as the bandits approached, John cursed under his breath for not having it in his hands already. The 5 riders emerged from the dust like wolves on the hunt, cloaks flapping, faces half covered with dirty bandanas. Their horses snorted and pawed the earth, eager for motion, for violence. The leader, a tall man with a scar running from his left eye to his chin, dismounted first. His spurs jingled with every step toward the porch. John stood still on the steps, trying to appear calm, but inside his mind was racing, calculating distance, counting enemies, remembering every bullet left in his ammo box. The desert around him was quiet except for the shifting hooves and the occasional rattle of a loose saddle. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy. It felt like the land itself knew something violent was about to happen. It started like most desert afternoons, blistering sun overhead, sweat trickling down John's back, and a dry wind rattling through brittle grass. He'd been out by the creek, poking around a patch of exposed rock, hoping to find some trace of silver or copper. Same as always. Same as every day for the last 3 years. John wiped the dust from his brow and straightened up, stretching sore muscles when something caught his eye. Movement. Not the loping gait of a jackrabbit or the slither of a rattlesnake. No, this was human, stumbling, slow, unsteady. A figure appeared on the ridgeline, a lone man, swaying as he tried to keep upright. From that distance, John couldn't see much detail, but the way the man staggered forward wasn't natural, like he was running from something or someone. Instinct kicked in. John grabbed his rifle and started moving toward the cabin, keeping one eye on the stranger, the other scanning the horizon for whatever trouble might be chasing him. By the time the man reached the edge of John's property, it was clear he was in bad shape. Clothes torn, blood crusted along his forehead, dust caked over everything. His boots were barely holding together, and every breath sounded like it was being dragged up from the bottom of his lungs. John raised a cautious hand. "That's close enough, friend." The stranger didn't stop. He stumbled forward another few feet, collapsing to his knees just short of the porch steps. John kept the rifle trained on him, but stepped closer, just enough to get a better look. "Water, please," the man croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper. John hesitated. Desert rules said you don't leave a dying man thirsty. Even if you don't trust him, you help him breathe first, ask questions later. He lowered the rifle slightly and fetched a battered tin cup from the porch. Filling it from the water barrel, he handed it over. The stranger drank like a man possessed, gulping until water dribbled from the corners of his mouth. Then, with shaking hands, he reached inside his coat pocket. John tensed, ready for trouble. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out something small and gold. A nugget. Rough. Heavy. About the size of a walnut. John's eyes widened. Even at a glance, he knew it was real. The stranger pressed it into John's palm with surprising strength for a man half dead. "I owe you one," he murmured, locking eyes with John for the first time. There was something unsettling about that gaze, sharp, calculating, like the man was still fighting battles in his head, even as his body failed him. Before John could ask a single question, "Who are you? Where did this come from? What kind of trouble are you in?" The stranger pushed himself to his feet with trembling effort. He staggered away from the porch, weaving through the mesquite trees, heading toward the hills beyond Coyote Creek. "Wait!" John called after him. No answer. The man disappeared into the dust and rocks, leaving John standing there, gold nugget in hand, heart pounding. For a long moment, John just stood still, staring at the piece of gold resting in his palm. The weight of it felt wrong, like it carried more than just value. It carried danger. He turned the nugget over in his fingers. It wasn't placer gold from the local creeks. No, this was hard rock gold, jagged and dense, likely from a deep vein, somewhere remote. And anyone desperate enough to hand over gold like this was likely running from something far worse than thirst. John glanced toward the horizon, where the stranger had vanished. The desert stretched endlessly, silent except for the distant cry of a hawk. But that silence wouldn't last. Something told John this was just the beginning. And sure enough, less than 3 hours later, 5 armed men would come thundering down that same trail, dust rising like smoke behind them, bringing with them one question and a whole lot of trouble. "Where's the gold?" The sun dipped lower behind the jagged cliffs, casting long shadows that stretched across John McAllister's worn cabin. The desert heat began to ebb, replaced by a creeping chill that whispered through the dry air. It was the kind of quiet that seemed too complete, like the world was holding its breath, waiting. John sat on the porch steps, the gold nugget heavy in his palm. He turned it over slowly, the rough edges catching the fading light. His mind raced, tracing the stranger's wild eyes, the urgency in his movements, and that desperate, half-spoken phrase, "I owe you one." Why had the man trusted him with something so valuable? And more importantly, what kind of danger was he now inviting? The wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from a distant campfire. John's eyes narrowed. Could be travelers, or it could be bandits. Out here, the two often looked the same. He stood and walked inside, bolting the door behind him. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in with a weight of uncertainty. On the table lay his rifle, leaned carefully against the corner. His fingers itched to grab it, but he held back, knowing the first move could spark the firestorm coming his way. Outside, the desert was settling into twilight. The shadows grew deeper, swallowing the colors of the earth until only shapes remained. Every creak of wood, every distant animal call seemed amplified in the stillness. John's ears pricked. A soft rustling from the mesquite grove. Maybe a rabbit or a coyote, or maybe something else. He stepped to the window, peering out through the cracked glass. Nothing but silhouettes shifting with the breeze. Minutes stretched like hours. His heartbeat echoed in his chest louder than the faint murmurs of the evening wind. He thought of the gold nugget again, the weight of it, the promise it carried, and the danger it invited. Then came a sound. Distant hooves pounding the cracked earth. Closer, closer. John's breath hitched. 5 sets of boots, moving fast, purposeful. He moved swiftly but silently, grabbing his rifle from the table and loading it with practiced hands. Every movement was precise. Years of living on the edge had taught him to stay calm when the world was about to erupt. The pounding hooves grew louder, dust clouds billowing in the distance. The bandits were coming. John backed away from the window, taking a position near the door. His fingers brushed the cold metal of his revolver in its holster. He glanced once more at the gold nugget lying on the table, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. This small piece of metal had changed everything. His quiet life was no longer his own. The horses thundered closer, the riders shouting commands that cut through the evening air like knives. John felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. Not fear exactly. Something sharper. Awareness. That moment before the storm hits, when the world tilts on its axis. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised, eyes scanning the approaching figures. The leader, a man with a cruel scar and cold eyes, spurred his horse forward and shouted, "Where's the gold, old man? Don't make this harder than it has to be." John's voice was steady as he replied, "I don't know what you're talking about." A tense silence fell. Then the first shot rang out, cutting through the dusk, shattering the calm. The desert night exploded into chaos. And John McAllister knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. The first thunder of hooves faded into a tense silence, broken only by the low murmur of restless horses and the crunch of gravel beneath heavy boots. John McAllister stood firm on his creaking porch, rifle gripped tightly in calloused hands, eyes narrowing as 5 men surrounded his cabin like predators circling prey. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with a jagged scar slicing down his left cheek, his cold gaze locked onto John. His fingers twitched near the handle of a revolver, ready to draw at the slightest provocation. "Old man," he growled, voice low and rough, "we don't want trouble, but we want the gold. You hand it over, and maybe you walk away." John's lips pressed into a hard line. "I told you, I don't know anything about any gold." A harsh laugh erupted from one of the other riders, a younger man with a missing front tooth. "Don't play dumb. That stranger who came through here? He gave you that nugget. You're holding onto his debt now." John's eyes flicked toward the table inside where the gold nugget lay, untouched but glowing like a beacon in the lantern's dim light. He knew better than to reveal his hand too soon. "Listen," John said slowly, trying to buy time, "I don't want violence. Take what you want and leave me be." The scarred leader stepped closer, his boots thudding heavy on the wooden porch. "You don't understand how this works. That gold belongs to us. We're the ones who dug it out of the hills. The stranger stole it. Think you can just keep it safe for him?" John's fingers tightened around his rifle. "Im notiev. And I don't intend to be." The younger bandit spat onto the dirt. "Words won't save you here. You'd better show us where that gold is, or we're taking it by force." John's gaze flickered briefly toward the edge of the porch where the rifle rested against the wall. Every instinct screamed for him to grab it, but the risk of sudden movement was high. 5 against 1, John thought grimly. Not the odds I like. Suddenly, the leader's eyes locked onto the window beside John. He pointed a finger. "What's that?" John followed the gesture. The window was cracked open just enough to let a breeze in. The flicker of candlelight inside cast shadows on the walls. "Trying to hide something?" the man sneered. John shook his head slowly. "Nothing hidden here, but an honest man trying to survive." Another bandit, broader and scarred across his knuckles, pulled a knife and began pacing the porch steps. "You think you can bluff us? We've got patience, but it's thin." John's mind raced. The bandits were testing him, probing for weakness, trying to break his resolve. He remembered the stranger's desperate eyes, the weight of that gold nugget in his palm. He also remembered the stories, the brutal men who took what they wanted by gunpoint, leaving no witnesses behind. His throat tightened. He took a steady breath, lifting his voice just enough to carry over the tense quiet. "There's no gold here," he said again, slower this time. "But if you're looking for trouble, you've found it." The leader's eyes gleamed with a sudden flash of anger. "Last chance, old man." Before John could react, one of the riders kicked the cabin door with enough force to splinter the wood. It cracked, sending splinters flying. John jerked his head toward the rifle. A shot rang out. The bullet struck the ground inches from the younger bandit's boot, sending a plume of dust into the air. Chaos exploded. Shouts, curses, and the thunder of hooves filled the air as John grabbed the rifle, stepping off the porch with deliberate calm. The bandits scattered, pulling pistols and aiming. John fired again, this time toward the closest rider charging forward. The man swore, clutching his arm, but pressed on. John ducked behind a broken barrel, his heart pounding, muscles tight as steel. He wasn't a gunslinger, but he wasn't about to let them take what wasn't theirs. Shots flew, dust and splinters kicked up. The desert seemed to hold its breath in the storm of violence. Then, amid the chaos, a chilling voice cut through the noise. Enough! The leader reined in his horse, raising a hand. Retreat for now. The bandits reluctantly pulled back, eyes burning with hatred. John lowered his rifle, chest heaving. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The gold nugget had come with a price, and now it was a debt he couldn't escape. As the dust settled, John stared at the fading trail of riders, already planning his next move. Because survival out here meant one thing: always be ready for the storm coming next. Night had swallowed the desert whole, draping the landscape in shadows thick and heavy as a shroud. John McAllister's cabin, once a quiet refuge from the harsh world, now stood isolated and vulnerable beneath a sky smeared with cold stars. The air was sharp, brittle with the promise of a hard wind, but inside, the silence was heavy with dread. The gold nugget lay on the rough wooden table, its dull gleam mocking the danger it had invited. John kept his rifle close, fingers twitching over the worn wood grip, every sense alert to the slightest sound beyond the cabin walls. Hours ago, 5 bandits had come riding like a storm, demanding the gold. The first confrontation had ended in chaos, but not in victory for either side. Now, they were circling, waiting, planning, hunting. John knew what was coming. The desert had a way of testing men, breaking them down until all that was left was pure survival. And tonight, the test was about to begin. At the first whisper of movement, John was ready. Outside, the horses shifted restlessly, their low whinnies blending with the crunch of dry brush under heavy boots. The bandits were creeping closer, using the darkness and the jagged rocks as cover. John's eyes flicked toward the windows, then to the small cellar hatch beside the porch. He had stocked it weeks ago with a few essentials: canned beans, a flask of whiskey, some dry crackers. If things got worse, he'd have to make a break for it, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. He checked the rifle's chamber one last time. Loaded, locked, ready. A sudden gust rattled the cabin door, sending a shiver down his spine. Then the first shot cracked through the night. It tore through the silence like a thunderclap, splintering wood near the window. John dug behind his chair, heart hammering. From outside, more gunfire erupted, sharp, brutal bursts that shattered the stillness. The bandits had started the siege. John fired back, aiming carefully through the cracked window. One of the riders fell, horse stumbling as a bullet caught him in the shoulder. The others cursed and scattered, circling around to flank the cabin. Minutes stretched on like hours, filled with the staccato rhythm of gunfire and shouted commands. John kept low, every shot measured and deliberate. His arms burned, muscles screaming, but adrenaline pushed him on. The bandits were ruthless. They fired through the walls, smashing windows, trying to force him out. But John had his own tricks. He lit a small lantern, moving it slowly from window to confuse their aim. A handful of old dynamite sticks, relics from a long-abandoned mine, were tucked in a corner. If the worst came, he might have to use them. Suddenly, a heavy object crashed against the cabin door, splintering wood and sending the frame trembling. The leader's voice rang out. "Come on out, McAllister. This is your last chance." John's grip tightened on the rifle. "I'm not your prize." Another volley of bullets tore through the porch, knocking loose a beam. Dust and splinters filled the air. A bandit tried to force the door, wrenching the handle with brute strength. The old lock groaned but held. John's mind raced. Outside, the enemy was tightening their grip. Inside, the cabin felt like a trap closing in. He glanced toward the cellar hatch. It was his only escape. But the bandits were clever. They'd guessed it too. From behind the cabin, footsteps crunched closer. John seized a nearby chair and shoved it against the cellar door, then retreated to his rifle by the window. Suddenly, a shadow loomed at the back. A figure appeared, a silhouette against the moonlight, rifle raised. John's breath caught. It was the stranger, the man who'd given him the gold. His clothes were torn, face gaunt and pale, but his eyes burned with a fierce determination. "You're not alone," the stranger whispered, sliding inside through a side door John hadn't locked. John nodded, relief crashing through the tension. Together, they prepared for the fight ahead. Hours passed in a blur of gunfire, shouted curses, and desperate strategy. They moved silently, covering each other, trading shots through shattered windows and broken walls. The bandits' numbers began to dwindle, 2 riders down, 1 bleeding badly. But the attackers showed no sign of quitting. Suddenly, a lantern exploded outside, lighting the cabin in fiery orange. The bandits had tossed a crude bomb, oil-soaked rags tied to a stick. Flames licked the wooden siding, spreading fast. John grabbed a bucket of water, dousing the flames inch by inch. Smoke filled the room, choking and thick. They had to act now. John pulled out the dynamite sticks, the stranger loading a rifle. Together, they made their final stand. When the bandits broke through the weakened door, expecting an easy kill, they found 2 men ready to fight like cornered wolves. Explosions rocked the cabin as John detonated the dynamite, sending splinters and dust flying. The blast knocked several bandits off their feet, scattering the survivors. As dawn broke over the scorched desert, silence fell again. John and the stranger sat amidst the ruins, bruised but alive. The gold nugget, still clutched tightly in John's hand, was a grim reminder. This battle was won, but the war was far from over. Out here in the vast, merciless desert, survival meant more than just courage. It meant never letting go of hope, and never trusting a stranger. Because sometimes, the greatest danger wasn't from the men outside, but from the secrets they carried within. The first light of dawn barely pierced the thick haze of smoke lingering over John McAllister's battered cabin. The night's siege had left deep scars, broken windows, charred wood, spent cartridges scattered across the dirt floor. John and the stranger sat back to back, breaths ragged, wounds stinging, but alive. John's fingers still curled tightly around the gold nugget, the symbol of the chaos that had engulfed his quiet life. Just as exhaustion threatened to pull them under, a sudden sound cut through the morning stillness, a sharp whistle echoing across the hills. Both men froze, eyes searching the horizon. More footsteps approached, but these weren't the heavy, cautious steps of bandits. This was something different. From the crest of a ridge appeared a small group of riders, 3 in number, moving fast and steady, guns holstered but ready. John squinted, recognition dawning. Sheriff Tom Hawkins and his 2 deputies. The sheriff had been skeptical about the rumors of bandits operating so close to Dustwater. But when the reports of gunfire reached town, he'd gathered his men and ridden hard, knowing John McAllister's reputation for holding his ground. "Looks like you're not as alone as you thought," the sheriff called out, spurring his horse toward the cabin. The bandits, caught between the lingering smoke and the approaching lawmen, hesitated, glancing nervously at each other. The stranger, still weak but alert, nodded toward the newcomers. Help came just in time. The sheriff dismounted, eyes sharp as he took in the scene. Broken door, scorch marks, the wary men inside. "John, you all right?" he asked gruffly. John gave a short nod. "Barely, but we've held them off." The deputies spread out, guns drawn, pushing the remaining bandits back. Caught off guard and outnumbered, the raiders had little choice. They surrendered quickly, lowering their weapons as the lawmen took control. One bandit tried to bolt, but was cut off by a deputy's steady shot. Sheriff Hawkins turned to John and the stranger. "You two held the line. That kind of courage doesn't go unnoticed." The stranger finally spoke, voice low but steady. "I came looking for the gold. Thought I could outrun them. Instead, I brought them here." John's eyes hardened. "That gold isn't just metal. It's a target. The sheriff nodded grimly. We'll take care of these men, but I'd advise you both to leave the area fast. Word of that nugget will bring worse trouble than this. John looked out over the cracked earth, the rising sun painting the sky in bruised pinks and golds. The desert had tested him and nearly broken him. But today, unexpected allies had arrived. And maybe, just maybe, survival wasn't about fighting alone. It was about knowing when to hold fast and when to trust. Because out here, help could come from the most unlikely places. And sometimes that made all the differences. The morning air was thick with tension as John McAllister and the stranger prepared for what they both knew was the inevitable, the final stand. The sheriff and his deputies had arrived, but the bandits were desperate, cornered in the rocky hills nearby, their numbers dwindling, but their fury burning hotter than ever. John checked his rifle one last time. The stranger, still bruised and weary, tightened his grip on his revolver. Together, they stood side by side, eyes scanning the rugged landscape for any sign of the approaching enemy. Suddenly, a shout rang out, sharp and desperate. The bandits had regrouped, their leader rallying them for one last assault. From behind a boulder, 5 rough figures charged, guns blazing. Bullets tore through the dry brush, kicking up clouds of dust and sending birds into frantic flight. John fired steadily, every shot measured and precise. The stranger covered his flank, picking off a rider who stumbled and fell hard against the rocky ground. The sheriff and deputies took positions on a ridge, their rifles cutting down anyone who tried to flank the defenders. The battle was brutal but brief. The bandits' charge faltered under the combined firepower and resolve of the men defending the cabin. One by one, the attackers dropped, surrendering or fleeing into the desert's vastness. When silence finally fell, it was broken only by heavy breathing and the crackling of dying fires. John wiped sweat and grime from his brow, glancing at the stranger. "We made it," he said quietly. The stranger nodded but didn't smile. At a cost. They surveyed the battlefield, spent cartridges, broken branches, and the harsh reminder of violence that had come to this remote corner of the world. Sheriff Hawkins approached, nodding with respect. "You held the line, both of you. This gold brought you trouble, but it also brought out courage." John looked down at the gold nugget, still safe in his pocket. He knew he couldn't keep it. It was a beacon for danger, a reminder of a life he wanted to leave behind. "I'll take it to the town," the sheriff offered. "Keep it safe. Maybe find a rightful owner, or at least keep it out of hands like these." John hesitated, then nodded. The stranger rested a hand on John's shoulder. "Maybe it's time for both of us to disappear for a while." John smiled faintly, the weight of years and battles easing just a little. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in golden light, John McAllister felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The fight was over. The siege had ended. But the desert was endless, and so was the story of survival. And somewhere deep inside, John knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where the gold nugget was no longer a curse, but a turning point. Because sometimes the greatest treasure wasn't the medal in your hand. It was the strength to stand and fight for what mattered, and the courage to keep living no matter the cost. Weeks passed after the final battle, and life around John McAllister's cabin began to settle back into its usual rhythm, slow, quiet, and unforgiving. The desert kept its secrets well, but the story of what had happened spread quietly through dust water. The sheriff had taken the gold nugget into safe custody, promising John it would not fall into the wrong hands again. That nugget, once a symbol of danger and chaos, had become a token of survival. John stood once more on the porch of his cabin, the vast Arizona sky stretching endlessly above him. The air was still, the kind that presses softly against your skin, whispering that peace was fragile but real. The dust that had once clung so heavily to everything was finally beginning to settle. The stranger, the man who had thrust the gold nugget and the storm it brought, had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. John hadn't asked where he was going. Sometimes, a man's past was his own business. John's rifle rested against the porch rail, polished and ready. But for the first time in years, it felt like a tool, not a burden. He sipped from a tin cup, watching the horizon where the sun dipped low in a blaze of gold and crimson. The desert could be brutal, unforgiving, and lonely. But it was also beautiful, a place where a man could find himself if he was willing to face the silence. This ordeal had changed John, not just because of the gold, or the bandits, or the shootouts. It had changed him because it reminded him that even in the most desolate places, human connection mattered. Courage mattered. Trust, rare and fragile, mattered. He thought about the gold nugget again. What it meant wasn't just wealth or danger. It was a catalyst, a story. And every story needed an ending. John wasn't sure what his next chapter held, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't be hiding in the shadows anymore. He was ready to face whatever came next, on his own terms. As the stars blinked awake one by one, the desert night wrapped around him like a promise. A promise that even after the fiercest storms, there was calm. And that sometimes the greatest victories were the ones fought quietly in the heart. John McAllister looked out into the vast darkness with a steady gaze. The stranger had given him more than gold that day. He had given him a chance, and John intended to make the most of it. The desert was wide, the road ahead uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, John felt free. The sun had set on the past. Tomorrow was a new dawn. John McAllister's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures come with the heaviest costs. A single act of kindness, accepting help from a stranger, can change everything for better or worse. The gold nugget wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of trust, risk, and the unpredictable nature of life. In the harshest moments, when danger closes in and hope feels distant, courage and resilience become the true wealth. John's journey shows us that survival isn't just about fighting off enemies. It's about holding on to what makes us human: trust, strength, and the will to keep moving forward no matter the odds. Sometimes, the battles we face aren't just with others, but within ourselves. And in those battles, choosing to stand tall, to fight for what matters, and to accept help when it comes, that's where real victory lies. What would you do if you were handed a chance, but danger followed close behind?